the sharing of biased and
False news has become all too common on social media.
More alarming, some media outlets publish things that simply aren't true without checking facts first.
Unfortunately, some members of the media use their platforms to push their own personal bias and agenda to control exactly what people think, and this is extremely dangerous to our democracy.
Nothing says free speech quite like a nationwide panel of propaganda outlets whom parrot each other with such absurd redundancy that you can literally layer them over each other word for word. It is in the spirit of free speech in which I will be presenting today's video. I seek to familiarize my audience with a litany of quotes from physicists, historians, and philosophers, some of these individuals quite prominent in their respective fields even into modern day. These quotes are very likely ones that you haven't heard before, unless you yourself have already dedicated an extremely large time researching these topics. Because, again, nothing says free speech like the mass censoring of what could be considered an entire genre of comments from experts in the fields of logic and science. This video will culminate with one of the more damning proofs of the existence of science fiction factoids within the realm of modern astrophysics, which is naturally extended into both the cosmological and cosmogonical models that have been produced as a result of this science fiction. So, on with the quotes. We begin with one Mr. George F.R. Ellis. Allow me to give a description of Ellis so that you understand the caliber of person I'm referencing here. According to Wikipedia, quote, George Francis Rayner Ellis, FRS, honorary FRSSAF, is the Emeritus Distinguished Professor of Complex Systems in the Department of Mathematics and Applied Mathematics at the University of Cape Town in South Africa. He co-authored The Large-Scale Structure of Space-Time with University of Cambridge physicist Stephen Hawking, published in 1973, and is considered one of the world's leading theorists in cosmology. From 1989 to 1992, he served as president of the International Society on General Relativity and Gravitation. He is a past president of the International Society for Science and Religion. He is an A-rated researcher with the NRF. Ellis, an active Quaker, was a vocal opponent of apartheid during the National Party reign in the 1970s and 1980s, and it is during this period that Ellis's research focused on the more philosophical aspects of cosmology, for which he won the Templeton Prize in 2004. He was also awarded the Order of the Star of South Africa by Nelson Mandela in 1999. End quote. Having given the appropriate background, allow me now to give his statement, quote, I can construct for you a spherically symmetrical universe with Earth at its center, and you cannot disprove it based on observations. You can only exclude it on philosophical grounds. In my view, there is absolutely nothing wrong with that. What I want to bring into the open is the fact that we are using philosophical criteria in choosing our models. A lot of cosmology tries to hide that. End quote. Quite revealing. Now, for the remainder of these quotes, we require a quick detour so that you can understand some of the references that are to be made. Let's make this detour short and sweet. Meet my dear friends, Albert Michelson and Edward Morley. These two individuals are famous for having conducted one of the most prominent experiments of the 19th century, which came to be known as the Michelson-Morley experiment, or rather, the Michelson-Morley failure.
The most famous was the Michelson-Morley experiment in 1887.
Tell us about that.
Well, they used light beams to measure whether the Earth was moving, and they found that there was no movement. The Earth has to be moving 30 kilometers per second to complete its annual revolution, and they found out that it wasn't moving in a very precise. Michelson could have calculated it to 1/100th of what he got in his experiment. That's how sensitive his instruments were.
What did the experiment involve in terms of apparatus, so we can get a concrete understanding of what they found?
If the Earth is moving around the sun, and we shoot that light beam in the direction that the Earth is moving, okay? And then we shoot another light beam perpendicular to that. Well, the one that's in the direction of the Earth's movement should be impeded in some way if it's moving through space, whereas this one that's going perpendicular would not be impeded.
Why not?
Because it's not going through space. It's just going north and south.
Okay.
Okay? And what they found, they expected to have a 30-kilometer difference between these two light beams. There was no difference. So the natural interpretation, and even Einstein admits this, Mach admits this, Born admits this, the natural interpretation is that the Earth isn't moving. So how do we get out of that? Well, you invent special relativity.
Despite the fantastic success that most physicists have with overcomplicating the explanation of any procedure, the experiment itself is actually quite simple. Shoot a beam of light into a beam splitter, causing the beam to propagate in two separate directions at right angles to each other, that is, perpendicular, 90 degrees relative to each other. So, say, north and west, for instance, or north and east, etc. The beam traveling in the opposite directions would impact with a mirror at either end, bounce back from these mirrors, and finally the beams would recombine to be recorded simultaneously on a detector which recorded the interference pattern of the waves. It should be said that when this experiment is not being brushed under the rug, it has instead been subject to continuous misinterpretation and overcomplicated and nullified with relativistic bullshit. This quote from Stephen Bryant should make this absolute horseshit misinterpretation quite clear, though I am sure he himself was completely unaware of what he was saying. Quote, "The Michelson-Morley interferometer experiment is commonly cited as experimental validation of special relativity. While Michelson and Morley conducted an Earth, or rather concluded, an Earth orbital velocity, EOV, of 5 to 7.5 kilometers per second, their result is generally accepted as 0 kilometers per second, with their observation attributed to experimental error." End quote.
You serious?
The absolute state of modern science. The result from the test is accepted as 0 kilometers per second. So the conclusion is that the Earth moves with the velocity of 7.5 kilometers per second. Mind-bogglingly absurd. And moving forward, the purpose of the experiment was to detect the movement of the Earth through what was being called the aether, or ether, by the scientific community at large during this point in history. The ether was the material, the medium, that was hypothesized to exist so that electromagnetic waves could have something to travel through. It makes sense, doesn't it? And here is where we hit a roadblock. Well, that is, a roadblock for heliocentrism. The Michelson-Morley experiment, as just stated a few moments ago, detected no motion. The wave patterns of the light, when recombined to form an interference pattern, should have produced results consistent with a 30 kilometers per second difference. But, well, they produced none, in any direction, at all, no matter how many times the contraption was rotated and reconfigured. So back to those quotes. Encyclopedia Britannica 1959, quote, "We may therefore say that the broad result of a series of experiments of Michelson-Morley type is that no motion of the Earth through the ether can be detected by an influence on the velocity of light." End quote. From Arthur Eddington, physicist, quote, "There was just one alternative. The Earth's true velocity through space might happen to have been nil." End quote. From Bernard Jaffe, physicist, quote, "The data of Michelson-Morley were almost unbelievable. There was only one other possible conclusion to draw, that the Earth was at rest." End quote. A quote from physicist James Coleman, quote, "The easiest explanation was that the Earth was fixed in the ether and that everything else in the universe moved with respect to the Earth and the ether. Such an idea was not considered seriously, since it would mean, in effect, that our Earth occupied the omnipotent position of the universe, with all other heavenly bodies paying homage by moving around it. End quote. A quote from historian Lincoln Barnett with a foreword by Albert Einstein, quote, "The Michelson-Morley experiment confronted scientists with an embarrassing alternative. On the one hand, they could scrap the ether theory, which had explained so many things about electricity, magnetism, and light. Or, if they insisted on retaining the ether, they had to abandon the still more venerable Copernican theory that the Earth is in motion. To many physicists, it seemed almost easier to believe that the Earth stood still than that waves, light waves, electromagnetic waves, could exist without a medium to sustain them. It was a serious dilemma, and one that split scientific thought for a quarter century. Many new hypotheses were advanced and rejected. The experiment was tried again by Morley and by others, with the same conclusion. The apparent velocity of the Earth through the ether was zero." End quote. A quote from physicist Richard Wolfson, quote, "What happened when the experiment was done in 1887? There was never in any orientation at any time of year any shift in the interference pattern. None. No shift, no friend shift, nothing. What's the implication? Here was an experiment that was done to measure the speed of the Earth's motion through the ether. This was an experiment that was 10 times more sensitive than it needed to be. It could have detected speeds as low as 2 miles a second instead of the known 20 miles per second that the Earth has in its orbital motion around the Sun. But it didn't detect it. What's the conclusion from the Michelson-Morley experiment? The implication is that the Earth is not moving." End quote. A quote from Albert Einstein, quote, "To the question whether or not the motion of the Earth in space can be made perceptible in terrestrial experiments, we have already remarked that all attempts of this nature led to a negative result. Before the theory of relativity was put forward, it was difficult to become reconciled to this negative result." End quote. Another quote from Albert Einstein, quote, "I have come to believe that the motion of the Earth cannot be detected by any optical experiment." End quote. A quote from physicist Henrik Lorentz, quote, "Briefly, everything occurs as if the Earth were at rest." End quote. A quote from physicist Henry Poincaré, quote, "A great deal of research has been carried out concerning the influence of the Earth's movement. The results were always negative." End quote. And I feel it important to insert here that negative means they couldn't detect it. Another quote from historian Lincoln Barnett, quote, "We can't feel our motion through space, nor has any physical experiment ever proved that the Earth actually is in motion." End quote. A quote from physicist Julian B. Barber, quote, "Thus, even now, 3.5 centuries after Galileo, it is still remarkably difficult to say categorically whether the Earth moves." End quote. A quote from physicist Bernard Cohen, quote, "There is no planetary observation by which we on Earth can prove that the Earth is moving in an orbit around the Sun." End quote. A quote from Stephen Hawking, quote, "So which is real, the Ptolemaic or Copernican system? Although it is not uncommon for people to say that Copernicus proved Ptolemy wrong, that is not true. One can use either picture as a model of the universe, for our observations of the heavens can be explained by assuming either the Earth or the Sun to be at rest." End quote. A quote from Steven Weinberg, quote, "If we were to adopt a frame of reference like Tycho's, in which the Earth is at rest, then the distant galaxies would seem to be executing circular turns once a year, and in general relativity, this enormous motion would create forces akin to gravitation, which would act on the Sun and planets and give them the motions of the Tychonic theory." End quote. A quote from astronomer Fred Hoyle, "Let it be understood at the outset that it makes no difference from the point of view of describing planetary motion, whether we take the Earth or the Sun as the center of the solar system. Since the issue is one of relative motion only, There are infinitely many exactly equivalent descriptions referred to different centers. In principle, any point will do, the moon, Jupiter. So the passions loosed on the world by the publication of Copernicus's book, De Revolutionibus Orbius Celestium, were logically irrelevant. End quote. Another quote from Fred Hoyle, quote, "We can take either the Earth or the Sun, or any other point for that matter, as the center of the solar system. This is certainly so for the purely kinematical problem of describing the planetary motions. It is also possible to take any point as the center even in dynamics, although recognition of this freedom of choice had to await the present century." End quote. A quote from the science writer Kitty Ferguson, quote, "It is possible to describe the entire universe using any chosen point as the unmoving center. The Earth will do very well, and no one can prove that choice is wrong. Scientists today prefer to picture everything in motion and nothing as being the center. If you haven't given much thought to the implications of 20th century science, you may be chagrined to realize that because of the concept of relative motion, no one can prove that the Earth moves." End quote. A quote from physicist Max Born, quote, "Thus, we may return to Ptolemy's point of view of a motionless Earth. This would mean that we use a system of reference rigidly fixed to the Earth, in which all stars are performing a rotational motion with the same angular velocity around the Earth's axis. One has to show that the transformed metric can be regarded as produced according to Einstein's field equations by distant rotating masses. This has been done by Thuring. He calculated a field due to a rotating, hollow, thick-walled sphere and proved that inside the cavity it behaved as though there were centrifugal and other inertial forces, usually attributed to absolute space. Thus, from Einstein's point of view, Ptolemy and Copernicus were equally right. What point of view is chosen is a matter of expediency." End quote. From physicist Hans Reichenbach, quote, "It is very important to acknowledge that the Copernican theory offers a very exact calculation of the apparent movements of the planets, even though it must be conceded that, from the modern standpoint, practically identical results could be obtained by means of a somewhat revised Ptolemaic system. It makes no sense, accordingly, to speak of a difference in truth between Copernicus and Ptolemy. Both conceptions are equally permissible descriptions. What has been considered as the greatest discovery of Occidental wisdom, as opposed to that of antiquity, is questioned as to its truth value." End quote. I feel it important to point out there that he specifically mentioned the Copernican theory and not Isaac Newton's universal law of gravitation, which fucked the Copernican theory, hence the existence of electric universe theories. A quote from astronomer J.L.E. Dreyer, quote, "The Earth-centered system is in reality absolutely identical with the system of Copernicus, and all computation of the places of the planets are the same for the two systems." End quote. A quote from physicist Dennis Sciama, quote, "Whether the Earth rotates once a day from west to east, as Copernicus taught, or the heavens revolve once a day from east to west, as his predecessors believed, the observable phenomena will be exactly the same. This shows a defect in Newtonian dynamics, since an empirical science ought not to contain a metaphysical assumption, which can never be proved or disproved by observation." A quote from astronomer Fred Hoyle, quote, "Tycho Brahe proposed a dualistic scheme, with the sun going around the Earth, but with all other planets going around the sun. And in making this proposal, he thought he was offering something radically different from Copernicus. And in rejecting Tycho's scheme, Kepler obviously thought so too. Yet, in principle, there's no difference." End quote. Another quote from astronomer Fred Hoyle, quote, "We now know that the difference between a heliocentric and a geocentric theory is one of motions only, and that such a difference has no physical significance. The Ptolemaic and Copernican views, when improved by adding terms involving the square and higher powers of the eccentricities of the planetary orbits, are physically equivalent to one another." End quote. A quote from physicist Richard Wolfson, quote, "So if Earth is at rest relative to the ether, then it alone is at rest. That makes us pretty special. Do you really want to return to parochial, pre-Copernican ideas? Do you really think you and your planet are so special that in all the rich vastness of the universe, you alone can claim to be at rest?" End quote. Talk about cynicism, huh? Physicist Lorentz Krauss, quote, "But when you look at CMB map, you also see that the structure that is observed is in fact, in a weird way, correlated with the plane of the Earth around the Sun. Is this Copernicus coming back to haunt us? That's crazy. We're looking out at the whole universe. That would say we are truly the center of the universe." End quote. Astrophysicist Max Tegmark, quote, "I have to confess that I was bothered by the fact that the so-called axis of evil seemed linked to a special direction in our solar system. But now we have completely independent data. This is a hint of something really big." End quote. A quote from Ashok K. Singhal, quote, "The apparent alignment in the cosmic microwave background in one particular direction through space is called evil because it undermines our ideas about the standard cosmological model. The Copernican principle seems to be in jeopardy." End quote. Astrophysicist Dragan Hutterer, quote, "Why is the solar system cosmically aligned?" End quote. A quote from the European Space Agency on the Planck probe, which was launched, or rather retrieved, in 2013. Regardless, the data received from the Planck probe, quote, "One of the most surprising findings is that the fluctuations in the cosmic microwave radiation temperatures at large angular scales do not match those predicted by the standard, that is, the Big Bang model." End quote. Now, frankly, there are more quotes, but I'm going to cut the quote short in order to progress to the next stage of the video. Now that I've addressed those quotes, again, I ask the listener to remember a rather somber fact, which is just because you yourself want to know the truth of a situation, or just because you yourself are willing to admit that you're wrong, or willing to admit that you don't know something, willing to accept that you've been lied to so that you can move past the lie rather than living in it, this does not mean that somebody else feels that way. There exist people on this earth that will argue anything at any time for any reason, simply for the sake of arguing. There exist people who are the exact opposite of you in every way, and who frankly couldn't give a rat's ass about the truth of a situation. There exists on this earth narcissists, psychopaths, sociopaths, egomaniacs, and though many people would never admit it, people who are so religious to a concept that they have lost the ability to see the concept objectively. Want proof? Ask someone if they ever saw the curvature of Earth from the top of a building, or a hill, or a mountainside, or an airplane, and see what they say.
Would be orbiting about a half an inch above the surface. And that dude who jumped out of a perfectly good balloon, what's his name? Felix Baumgartner, he would have been about 2 millimeters above the surface of this globe. That's his edge of space jump. Now, you know, I don't, it's fine. He wants to, I don't have a problem if he does it, but the honesty of it would greatly diminish what I think people thought he was actually doing. And not only that, they made sure to photograph him standing there with a really wide-angle lens, which curves horizontal lines. Right. So in the photo, you see this curvature of Earth's surface, and he said, "Wow, he's in space, look at that." No, he's not. At that height, you don't see the curvature of the Earth if you are 2 millimeters above this beach ball.
Ask a person if the surface of extended bodies of standing water can curve, and see what they have to say. See how they hold up to truth. Not everyone is like you, and many so-called adults will go down fighting tooth and nail even when backed into a corner and proven factually wrong, rather than admit that they were wrong. So, for the culmination, vacuums in space. I'll make this part quick. Here's a video of a 7/16 inch thick steel jacketed train tank cart with the vacuum safety seals removed. Now, we can assume this video to be taking place at sea level, with an average atmospheric pressure of roughly 14.7 psi. When the train tank cart is exposed to a low or rough internal vacuum, the air pressure of 14.7 psi pushing in from all sides of the exterior is enough to crush the train tank cart like a tin can. It's rather violent, enough to make me feel uneasy just watching it, frankly. Now here are the differing levels of vacuum. At the top end of the scale, we have a low vacuum, such as the one the tank train cart was exposed to, which falls just underneath the level of one standard atmospheric pressure of 14.7 psi. At the bottom end, we have the vacuum levels associated with interstellar space. That unit of measurement you see on the top right, the torr, it's a unit of pressure, with one torr being defined as exactly 1/760 of a standard atmosphere. Again, one standard atmosphere is defined as 14.7 psi. So let's analyze this situation. The vacuum level of interstellar space, according to this chart, is quintillions of times higher than a vacuum like the one that crushed the 7/16 inch thick steel train tank cart, like a fucking pop can, like a crumpled up piece of notebook paper. And these absolute clowns at NASA would have you believe that a Michelin Man outfit, aka an astronaut suit, will protect an astronaut from the vacuum of space?
You serious?
So the question becomes, how much are you willing to believe? How willing are you to let someone explain away the obvious? At what point do you call bullshit and walk away from the game? Bear in mind, I don't even agree with the notion that space is a vacuum to begin with. I don't know. But, regardless, this is nothing more than the inconsistent logic present in the realms of heliocentrism, whose own science literally defeats itself at every turn. So, for the sake of brevity, I'm going to cut myself off from further explanation in this particular video because, frankly, I could go on likely for multiple hours straight at the absolute absurdity that has been covered up by narcissistic South Park characters that refer to themselves as professors or scientists. I have no doubt that these types of videos will be nowhere near as popular as videos pertaining to the Black Sun or generally to occulted mythology, and I certainly will continue with those types of videos as I find them important, but this material is frankly that which really needs to be understood en masse, whether it gets me views or not. And on that note, thank you to everyone who watches this, and thank you to everyone who supported my Black Sun video. That video garnered massive attention relative to my non-existent YouTube channel, which only had 19 subscribers when I had posted that video. So thank you to everybody. I appreciate you. Stay thirsty for knowledge, and until next time, much love.